this morning in this moment, and we pray it all in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen. Okay, well, today you are going to school. We're going to be spending some time in the book of Genesis today, and I'm going to be doing a lot of explanations about the book of Genesis. So some of today will be academic. If you need to get up and run some laps or do some calisthenics to make sure your blood is flowing well enough, that might be necessary at some point in time, because some of the stuff we're talking about is academic, and I know some of you didn't really enjoy school when you were in it. But others of you, you're just going to eat this thing up. So we're going to have a lot of fun this morning. But the question I want to start out with today is, if you had the opportunity to go back in time and do something over again, would you? If you had the opportunity to go back and fix something, would you? If you're familiar with the series of movies, Back to the Future, there's 1, there's 2, and there's 3. They don't have any other names. That was back when movies were just named with numbers. But so Marty McFly in the first movie, he goes accidentally to his past, and he somehow ruins things in his past, but he's able to fix it before he makes it back to the present. And when he does make it back to the present, he learns that everything is now better. Especially, he's got a nice, sweet black truck. That's the coolest part about the end of the movie. But how the movie ends is Doc Brown comes with the time machine, and he comes up to Marty McFly, and he says, "Marty, you have to come back with me." And Marty says, "Where?" He goes, "Back to the future." So there you get the line from the title of the show. He says, "Back to the future, because something's wrong in the future." So Marty needs to go to the future to fix the problem in his future. And while they're in the future, that's movie 2 now. So in movie 2, Marty McFly finds a sports almanac. And he realizes that if he brings this sports almanac back with him to the past, to 1985, then in 1985, he will be able to predict all of the sporting events for the next 25 years, and he'll be able to make a killing just by playing the odds, gambling and stuff. So he buys this book, but Doc Brown tells him, "No, you can't bring something from the future back to the past. That'll mess up the space-time continuum," because that's what it's all about. And so then he throws it in the trash, but old man Biff finds the book and steals the time machine car, and he goes back to the past where he gives it to himself as a young man. So that when Marty McFly gets back to 1985, he finds out that the 1985 he knew is no longer there. And he's now in a completely different 1985. So this time his dad is dead, his mom is married to Biff, the bad guy, and the entire town has become basically Las Vegas, and Biff is in charge, and it's all, they want to try to communicate. This is interesting. They want to communicate that Las Vegas is a bad place, is what they're really trying to do in the movie. So anyway, then Marty McFly is like, we have to figure out what went wrong and when it went wrong. And even though what went wrong is that in the future the time machine was stolen, they decide they need to go to the past so they can find the book and steal it back from the Biff of the past. And instead of, I don't know. But so anyway, they need to go to the past, and they find the book and they steal it back from Biff. And so the Biff of the past, then in the Biff of the present, he's not the guy in charge anymore. And then, so anyway, it gets convoluted. But here's the point. When you find out something went wrong, sometimes you have to trace it back to when it went wrong. And then once you figure that out, you ask the question, man, I wish I could have fixed that. I wish I could just go back in time to solve that problem back when it happened. So the question that I want to ask you, as you think about that one decision you made, that one moment, that one event in your life, the thing that happened that if you had the time machine, you would go back and change it. The question I want to ask you is, how far back would you go? Would you go back to the moment when you made the decision, or would you go back farther? In the movie, does Marty McFly go back to when the book was given to Biff, or does he go back to when the book was stolen from the trash can, or does he go back to when Biff was born, or does he go back even before that? And in fact, the third movie, they're way in the Old West, and it's crazy. But how far back do you go? Listen, if you want to know why things went wrong, you have to know how they went wrong. And then you have to ask the question, if we could get back there, would we? The book of Genesis is a book about all of that. It's a book about how things went wrong, when they went wrong, and what can possibly be done to solve it. What can possibly be done to fix it. And so it's a book of beginnings. In fact, as we talk through the book of Genesis, we're going to see that it's got lots of beginnings, not just one. And perhaps in this series, you'll be able to find a new beginning for your own life as well as we study the book of beginnings. So, with all that said, I want to introduce to you this series. We are going to be in the book of Genesis from now all the way through the first week of June. That's a long time. We don't usually take that long for series of messages, but Genesis is 50 chapters, and we have to hit it somehow, and we're just going to plow our way through it. But I'll tell you this, even though it's a long run, we're even going to do Easter from Genesis. Yeah, that'll be cool. Trust me, it's going to be neat. But we're going to cover Genesis. This is a long run. Now, I'm telling you something. You need to be here for every single possible Sunday you can, because Genesis builds on itself. Because what happens today is going to show up again next week. And what happens next week is going to have implications for the next week. And what happens in mid-May is going to be based on something that happens in the end of February. So you need to somehow make sure you can make it to as many of these as possible, because they all build on each other. But I'm going to give you one extra little help. During this whole series, as we're working through Genesis, we want you to spend some time with Genesis on your own. And so the leaders of this church, Billy, myself, and some others, are going to be publishing on our website every single day from now until June, without counting the weekends, because, hey, I want to sleep in too. But we're going to publish from now through June a daily devotional as we go through the book of Genesis together. So if you subscribe to our Facebook page, if you subscribe to our Twitter feed, do one of those things, find us on Facebook or Twitter, follow those things, and check it out, because at 5 a.m. every weekday, we're going to publish another devotional guide for those of you who get up that early. But so whatever, we're going to publish these things. Billy's already written his for Tuesday. I haven't written mine yet for tomorrow, but it will be there tomorrow. All right? So that's all the preliminary stuff. That's all the introductory stuff. I want to give you the book of Genesis. So let's start by talking about the book itself. The book of Genesis is a really interesting book. It's a very easy to read book. There are many people who say, hey, I'm going to start reading the New Testament. I'm going to start reading the Old Testament. I'm going to start reading the Bible. Anyone who starts with the book of Genesis and they want to read the book of Genesis, they find it pretty easy to follow. In fact, they usually make it all the way to Leviticus before they quit. And you've been there. I hear, you've been there. Genesis is an easy book to follow, but it's got some really big questions in it. And so we're going to deal with some of these questions first before we actually look at the text. And the first question is the question about, academic stuff like title and author and structure. Let me give you a couple ideas about Genesis, title, author, and structure. First of all, the title Genesis is a Greek word. It means beginnings. It means how things formed. It means how things started. But Hebrew people did not use the word Genesis for this book because, of course, that's Greek. The Hebrew people, the Jewish people, referred to this book by the first word that is found in the Hebrew Bible. The first word found in the Hebrew Bible sounds like this, Bereshit. And that word means in the beginning. In the beginning. And so they refer to this book as Bereshit. It is the book in the beginning. So that's what its title is. There you go. It means beginnings. It's all about beginnings. Not just one beginning, but a whole lot of beginnings. Secondly, let's talk about the author. This is another kind of academic thing. If you're taking notes, you might want to jot down a few things. Otherwise, just pay attention as much as you can. But for about 200 years, the book of Genesis, along with the other 4 books that form the first 5 books of the Old Testament, called the Pentateuch, those 5 books have been under some sort of secular scrutiny. They've been criticized, and they've not been criticized based on what they've taught. They've been criticized based on other things like structure and author and things like that. In fact, for about 200 years, people have postulated that Genesis is actually a book that was written in separate sections over a long period of time, and someone eventually stuck them all together. This is called the documentary hypothesis. It's a guess that maybe Genesis was split up into all kinds of different pieces, and then someone later put it all together. If you're ever watching Nova or one of these other programs where it's got people who claim to be Bible scholars, you might hear this kind of thing come up, so I'm going to mention it to you just real quickly. So, if you look in Genesis chapter 1, God is referred to with the name Elohim. If you look in Genesis chapter 2, God is referred to with the name Yahweh. So which is it? Does God go by the name Elohim? Does God go by the name Yahweh? Well, the conclusion that some people have made is that actually these are two completely different creation stories. Genesis 1 was written by a bunch of people who called God Yahweh, or called God Elohim, and Genesis 2 was written by a bunch of people who called God Yahweh. And later on, the Jewish people said, okay, let's take both of these stories and we'll claim it's our God, you know? And so some people have claimed that there's the Yahweh camp, and that's symbolized by the German letter that they use at the beginning of the word Yahweh, which isn't a Y, it's a J in German. And so J is one of these letters that serves to reference the Yahweh camp. And then E is the letter that refers to the Elohim camp. And then there's a camp for Deuteronomy, all by itself. It kind of stands out on its own. They give that a D. And then there's another camp for the priests. And the priests are the ones who are concerned about genealogies and things like that. So all the genealogies fall under the letter P. So what they've done is, this is called this documentary hypothesis. They claim that there's a J part, there's an E part, there's a D part, there's a P part, and someone in the past centuries took all these different pieces and smashed them together, mixed them together into the book we call Genesis. For about 200 years, scholars have believed this to be the case. However, recently, scholarship has demonstrated that, you know what? That's really lame. Because there are some parts of things that happen in an E section, or happen in a J section, that later get referenced in the other section. You know, they split the whole book of Genesis into these different sections, and yet there's some parts that show up in this section that then they show up again in this section. It's like, well, wait a minute. If the same thing shows up in both sections, they can't be coming from two different places. As a matter of fact, recent scholarship is beginning to show that the book of Genesis is just, one book. That the book of Genesis is really just one story that a guy has woven together, has written down, and if it uses one particular set of language for one part of it and a different set of language for another part, so what? It's still one story that all fits together. And so modern scholarship is basically concluding this. We have no reason to doubt that Moses actually wrote it. The ancient Jewish people believed Moses wrote it, and we have no reason to doubt it. There's no real evidence, no hard and fast evidence that it could not have come from one guy back in the 1500s BC who was educated in Egypt, in Pharaoh's court, and that would have been Moses. So here's the deal. I believe Moses wrote down Genesis. He is the primary author of Genesis. Now, just a quick aside. There's some parts in Genesis where it says a little tiny phrase like, and those people still exist to this day. And that little side notes, the kind of marginal notes, we think that some of those things could have been added later on, added after Moses died, because someone was trying to make sure people understood that this book was still relevant to them. But frankly, it doesn't change the meaning of the text if someone has added a few comments later on, because if I say the people lived, and then you say the people lived and they still live to this day, then we're both saying the same thing. It's not like you're giving a lie on top of my truth. So even though I say Moses is the primary author, there have been other people who might have been adding in little snippets here and there, okay? The bottom line is this document that we have, Genesis, claims to be God's word to us. It came from Moses. I believe it came from Moses on top of the mountain, and he wrote it all down, and then he's giving it to us. One last comment real quick about the structure. The book of Genesis is split into 11 sections. Each one of those sections, except for one, it begins with the phrase, these are the generations of. The Hebrew word for that is toledot. And so anytime you see the words, these are the generations of, in fact, you find them in early chapter 2, it says, these are the generations of. If you ever see these are the generations of, you know a new section is beginning. That's the beginning of a new section. The book does not begin with that phrase. It begins with in the beginning, which is a nice place to begin a story. But so you got 11 sections, 10 times it uses this in the generations of phrase to divide it up. So that's interesting. It'll become more interesting later on when I explain why that's significant, not today, but in the coming weeks. But one more thing. The book is divided also into two halves, and not really halves either. The first 11 chapters cover 20 generations of humans. But the remaining, from chapter 12 to 50, covers only 4 generations of humans. So from 1 to 11, we cover 20 generations. From 12 to 50, we cover only 4. And the point of that is that something's going on in the 4 generations that is so important and so significant we need to get details. But stuff that happened with the 20 generations before them isn't really as important. I mean, it's important, but the details aren't as important. And so if you ever come across someone and you're talking about Genesis, and they seem to spend all their time in the first 11 chapters and are sort of missing the boat on the remaining chapters through 50, maybe they're paying too much detail attention to the wrong part. Because the book is clearly trying to pay more attention to these 4 generations as opposed to the 20 that came before them. Okay? That's a good framework, good place of reference for you. Now let's talk about themes. If you're taking notes, you might want to jot down a few things. The entire book of Genesis basically covers one story, one theme, and the theme goes like this. God makes everything good. Humans screw it up. God reboots. Humans screw it up. God reboots. Humans screw it up. God reboots. Eventually, the question is left at the end, is this thing going to last? Are we ever going to find a solution? That's the theme of the book. God started it good. It all goes through this cycle of problems, and the question remains, will it ever get good again? Has God finally solved the problem for us? Okay, that's the major theme. Next, let's talk about some problems. The book of Genesis has created a lot of problems, particularly for people who are interested in modern science. There are 4 different aspects of science where we find some of these problems. Science number 1 is cosmology. If you take telescopes and you look out into space, you're going to find that there are stars really, really far away from us. I mean, really far away from us. In fact, there's a type of star that doesn't even exist as a star. It's kind of inappropriate to call it a star, but it's scientists believe that at one point in time in the way long past, there was a major explosion. Some people call it the Big Bang. And they say that with radio telescopes, we can still hear it. It's called the cosmic microwave background radiation. It won a couple guys a Nobel Prize. And the whole world seems to recognize that this thing is actually out there. It seems to be true. And they measured it to be 13.7 billion light years away. But if you read Genesis chapter 1, it says God created everything in 6 days. So there's a problem with cosmology. Some people are like, well, how can the universe be 13.7 billion years old? Because we can hear from something that's 13.7 billion light years away. How can it be that old and yet also be 6 days of creation? The cosmology problems. There's another problem in anthropology. Anthropologists say that human beings started in Africa. But the Bible seems to indicate that human beings started in Mesopotamia, a region modern-day Iraq. So what's that all about? Also, there's geology problems. Geologists tell us that it took the Grand Canyon a long time to form. Geologists tell us that at one point in time, Indiana was under ice because of the ice ages, and that was thousands and thousands of years ago. Geologists tell us different sorts of things about the rocks they find and the radioactivity of those rocks, and they've concluded that the Earth has to be around 3.5 billion years old. But if you do the math in early Genesis, you come up with an Earth that's about 6,000 to 8,000 years old. So, what's up with that? And then finally, there's the archaeology evidence. See, the early passages of Genesis tell us that there's dudes who lived 900 years old. Methuselah, 969. Lamech, 777. Adam is over 900. So how do these people live 900 years and we don't have any archaeological evidence of people living that long? What's that all about? So we've got problems in all these different areas, and some people use those problems to write off the book of Genesis. Today I'm going to deal with problem number 1 just a little bit, the cosmological problem, the how old is the universe kind of problem. Hopefully we'll deal with that in just a little bit, but the rest of the weeks you're going to have to come back to hear how we deal with some of these other problems. So let's get into the most important issue that we face. We are already upside down if we are worried too much about these problems. Instead, let's start fresh with what's the most important question when we come to the text. And here it is. I'm just going to give it to you. You might want to write this down, memorize it or something, because it's not just for Genesis, it's for everything. The most important question is, what is the text actually teaching? What is the text actually teaching? Now, this is really important for us because too many times people get into this mindset that says, oh, there's all these details. Let's unpack all these details. Let's find the secret meaning hidden in the text. And I'm telling you, all that stuff is bogus. Don't ever bother with anyone who tells you they found secret hidden meaning in the text, because this is more about what it's actually trying to teach us rather than what it's trying to keep from us. Pay attention to that. The Bible is more about what it's trying to teach us than what it's trying to keep from us. Okay? I'll give you an example. Imagine a teacher. She's standing in front of her class, and she says to the class, "Class, this morning, I woke up, and I looked out my bedroom window, and the sunrise was amazing. I saw the sun come up over the horizon, and the sky went ablaze with reds and oranges and yellows and baby blue. It was astonishing." So kids, today, your homework assignment is to go to bed early enough so that you can wake up tomorrow, see the sunrise, and write for me just a couple sentences on how it looks to you. Descriptive paragraph on the sunrise. So kids, tomorrow morning when the sun comes up, I want you to see it. I want you to write down some thoughts for me, okay? That's your homework. Now, I know some of you would get an F on that assignment because you come to the 10:45 worship time. Yeah. I made a joke, and there were some 9 o'clock people here who were saying they were going to fail it. But anyway, so I know some of you wouldn't make it. But here's the question. Is the teacher lying? What? See, the teacher has told something to these students that is patently false. I mean, she's a teacher. She should know better. The sun doesn't rise. The sun doesn't move above the horizon. Everybody in our society today knows that the earth rotates. It's not the sun that's moving in the sky, it's the earth that rotates. And so the sun is not rising. How can she possibly tell the students that the sun is rising? You know, what's up with that? Is she lying? Now, of course, every single one of us in this room would be like, no, that's dumb. Of course she's not lying. Sunrise is just the word we use to refer to the astronomical phenomenon for the sun appearing over the horizon and the atmosphere of the earth refracting the lights in such a way so we can see reds and oranges and blues. I mean, come on. That's obvious. We know that stuff. So sunrise is just the word we use. You see, the point is, the teacher was never trying to teach anything about the movement of the sun. She was trying to teach how beautiful it is when you see it. She was trying to teach that these kids need to learn how to write about beauty. What she's trying to teach has nothing to do with the details of the language she's using to teach. Follow me on that? In fact, check this out. Let's assume that this teacher is really, really behind the times, and she believes the earth is flat, and she believes that the sun actually does move through the sky. If she believes all that stuff with her heart, but says these same words to the students, is she still telling the truth? Yeah, because that's just the language we use to refer to what it looks like when the sun and the horizon do their thing. Even though the truth is that the earth is moving lower around that curve and the sun is showing up, and in fact, it's all sideways too. It's like this. It's not like, coming over us. Even though that's what's happening, it doesn't mean that she's lying. You have to pay attention to what is actually being taught, not some of the details around it that are just associated with human language. Okay? Now, with all that said, I want to read for you Genesis chapter 1 and a couple verses into chapter 2 so we can get the creation account. And I want you to follow along with me. It's going to take about 4 minutes to make it all the way through. Follow along with me, and let's just see what the text actually says so we can learn what it's actually teaching. Here we go. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now, the earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. And God said, "Let there be light." And there was light. God saw that the light was good, and He separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness He called night. And there was evening, and there was morning the first day. And God said, "Let there be a vault between the waters to separate water from water." So God made the vault and separated the water under the vault from the water above it. And it was so. God called the vault sky. And there was evening and there was morning the second day. And God said, "Let the water under the sky be gathered together to one place, and let dry ground appear." And it was so. God called the dry ground land, and the gathered waters he called seas. And God saw that it was good. Then God said, "Let the land produce vegetation, seed-bearing plants and trees on the land that bear fruit with seed in it, according to their various kinds." And it was so. The land produced vegetation, plants bearing seed according to their kinds, and trees bearing fruit with seed in it according to their kinds. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening and there was morning the third day. And God said, "Let there be lights in the vault of the sky to separate the day from the night, and let them serve as signs to mark sacred times and days and years. And let them be lights in the vault of the sky to give light on the earth." And it was so. God made two great lights, the greater light to govern the day and the lesser light to govern the night. He also made the stars. God set them in the vault of the sky to give light on the earth, to govern the day and the night, to separate light from darkness. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening and there was morning the fourth day. And God said, "Let the water teem with living creatures, and let birds fly above the earth across the vault of the sky." So God created the great creatures of the sea and every living thing with which the water teems and that moves about in it according to their kinds, and every winged bird according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. God blessed them and said, "Be fruitful and increase in number, and fill the water in the seas, and let the birds increase on the earth." And there was evening, and there was morning the fifth day. And God said, "Let the land produce living creatures according to their kinds, the livestock, the creatures that move along the ground, and the wild animals, each according to its kind." And it was so. God made the wild animals according to their kinds, the livestock according to their kinds, and all the creatures that move along the ground according to their kinds. And God saw that it was good. Then God said, "Let us make man in our image, in our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, over the livestock and all the wild animals, and over all the creatures that move along the ground." So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God he created them. Male and female he created them. God blessed them and said to them, "Be fruitful and increase in number. Fill the earth and subdue it. Rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky and over every living creature that moves on the ground." Then God said, "I give you every seed-bearing plant on the face of the whole earth, and every tree that has fruit with seed in it. They will be yours for food. And to all the beasts of the earth and all the birds in the sky and all the creatures that move along the ground, everything that has the breath of life in it, I give every green plant for food." And it was so. God saw all that he had made, and it was very good. And there was evening and there was morning, the sixth day. Thus the heavens and the earth were completed in all their vast array. By the seventh day, God had finished the work he'd been doing. So on the seventh day, he rested from all his work. Then God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, because on it he rested from all the work of creating that he had done. Okay, so here's the issue. We've got a text that tells us God did this on day 1, he did this on day 2, he did this on day 3, he did this on day 4. It takes 6 days, then he takes the 7th day and rests. He takes the day off. So how can we deal with this problem of cosmology? How can we deal with this problem where scientists say the whole universe is this old and it all happens this slowly, and evolutionary biology and all this kind of stuff? How do we deal with all that and still claim that the Bible is telling us something true, that it's teaching us something true? Well, I'm going to give you 4 options. 4 options for how you can still believe the Bible is teaching you something true in light of what science is telling us from the outside. Okay? Option number 1, 6 literal day-night cycles of creation. 6 literal day-night cycles of creation. So this is your first option. It's the option held by Ken Ham and the Creation Research Institute. If you watched that thing this last week, where he was on a debate with Bill Nye, the science guy, you saw that? I don't know if you did or not, but I was kind of disappointed with some of the things that were said. But anyway, so here's one approach. And this approach has some pros. The pros to this approach are that you look in the Bible and you say, it says 6 days, let's go with 6 days. Ken Ham's basic approach is this. We weren't there when it all happened, so no matter what kind of science we do, since science is based on observation, we can't observe the past. And so all of our extrapolations from the present are based on certain assumptions that may or may not be true in the past. Ken Ham says, I would rather trust the Bible than trust the extrapolations of science. Okay, that's his approach. And that's a valid approach for someone who wants to believe the Bible is teaching us the truth. 6 literal days. Now, it's also got a couple problems with that approach. Number one of those problems is that if you take that approach, then basically what you're saying is that every single detail of this account has some type of spiritual significance, has some type of importance. For example, if it says it happens in 6 days, then 6 days are what we have to stick to. And once you go there, then it gives us other kinds of questions. Well, if God created the sky to separate the water above from the water below, that must mean that there's actually water out there. That above the sky, there's a layer of water out there, or there was a layer of water out there. And then you begin to pay attention to all these kinds of details that may or may not be intended by the text. So let's look at some of the other options and then see what the text is actually teaching us after that. Your next option after this is that this whole account is totally mythical. This whole account is totally mythical. There are a lot of people who believe the Bible is true, and what Genesis 1 is teaching us is something that's sort of like an analogy, that God is just mostly trying to speak against the other cultures around at the time. You see, the other cultures believed that the world was created when all these other gods got mad at each other, and then they did things against each other, and out popped the world, okay? That's kind of the strategy of all these other ancient religions and all these other ancient schools of thought. But here's the deal, that this passage tells us that God did it. And he did it in these 6 days. And so some people say it's all analogy, it's just metaphor, and it's not intended to teach us mechanisms, okay? And so they take it to be mythical, not in the sense that it's not true, but in the sense that it's an allegory, like Jesus telling a parable or something along those lines. That it's still teaching us a true principle, but it's not telling us anything about historical fact. That's option 2. Option 3 are those people who say that each one of these days refer to long epochs of time. Each day is a long epoch of time. And that would mean that, here we've got day number 1, and it didn't just take 24 hours. It took a long period of time. After all, how do you measure a day when the sun hasn't been created yet, right? So how long is a day? Does it really need to be 24 hours, or could it be longer? Well, they say it could be longer. So it's just a long period of time. Day, the word day, is metaphorical for a period of time, okay? Here's your 4th option. And interestingly enough, this 4th option is an option that I've never heard anyone teach before other than me. So take this with a grain of salt, all right? But a couple years back, I was thinking through this stuff, and I heard one particular perspective from a man named Hugh Ross, and it was like a little light bulb went off in my brain, and I thought, that could, and oh, that might be it. So anyway, maybe I'm the first one to discover this. Maybe I'm just wrong. But anyway, option number 4 is this. This is my approach personally. That these are 6 literal days of revelation. 6 literal days of revelation. In my tiny little brain, this is how it works. Moses goes up on the mountain where God gives him the 10 commandments, and God says to Moses, hey, I got something to show you. Check this out. And God shows Moses a fast-forward time lapse of creation. And it takes him a whole day to see light come into being and then get separated from darkness. And God says, okay, that's enough. Go to bed. And there was evening, and then there was morning. And that was the first day. And then Moses sees day number 2 in fast-forward time-lapse form, and he sees it in front of him. And so for Moses, it actually is 6 literal 24-hour days. And he's waking up and he's going to bed, and there's morning and there's evening, and it's all happening. But God is revealing it to Moses. And you know what's fascinating about this? If you take a look at the 6 days of creation from the perspective of a person standing on this planet, it fits with, in large measure, not exactly, but it fits in large measure with what we hear from scientists about the formation of the universe. The first thing that would be present would be light. Stars and things would come later. And if you're standing here on the surface of the planet, the whole sky would be covered with a deep, thick cloud, because in the earliest days of the Earth's formation, it was kind of like Venus, and it was covered with this deep, thick cloud that you wouldn't be able to see individual stars, and you wouldn't be able to see the moon and the sun, but you would have been able to see light. And so later on, then as the clouds would clear, then you'd be able to see the sun, moon, and stars. So at least it fits. It's a possibility. If Moses saw the 6 days of creation happening in 6 days of revelation, and he saw them from the perspective of a person standing on the earth, it absolutely coincides currently with all the kinds of different theories that are out there with regard to cosmology. So there's at least a possibility that what's going on in Genesis 1 is actually fully in line with what scientists think actually happened. Now, there's one last thing I'll say. I believe that the God who can make something out of nothing can make something in any amount of time he wants. And so here's the deal. Personally, my conviction is that your options for trusting Genesis 1 come down to option number 1 and option number 4. I think both of those options do justice to the text. And I believe God is powerful enough that if he wanted to create a 13 billion-year-old universe with the snap of his finger, he could. After all, when he made Adam and Eve, he didn't make them as infants and then wait around 30 years for them to grow up. He made them as adults, which means he created them already old. It's possible that he had done the same thing when he created the universe. So that when we do all of our math and all of our extrapolations, it's perfectly consistent going backwards into the past, but maybe there's a point in time when the math stops, when the math keeps going, but the reality stops. You know what I'm saying? Because it's possible God had already created the earth old. I think option 1 and option 4 are your valid options, your best options. But now let's find out what the text actually has to teach us. There are 3 keys to understanding what this text actually teaches. And the first key comes in the first verse. Genesis 1:1 says this. Let's put it up on the screen. In the beginning, God created. The Hebrew word there is bara. And every time you see the word made or created in this passage, until we get to humankind, it is the Hebrew word bara. And bara is a particular word that says it just made. He just made it. He didn't need to shape anything or fashion anything. It's just the simplest word for creation that there is. But here's the most important part about that. In the beginning means there was a beginning. Before their beginning, God was already there. In the beginning, God. So when things began, God was already there. That means that God is the only God. That means that all the things that exist came from God. That means that God at some point in time chose to make things happen. That means that God is creative because he created this whole world. That means that God is intentional. And that means, above all else, you need to learn this. God wanted you to be here. God wanted this world to be here. Because there was a point in time when all this stuff wasn't here, and God said, now it's time. Let's get it done. In the beginning, God created. He didn't need to start with anything. He just made it happen. Let's keep going. Because the next key we get is something that is not familiar to American ears, but would have been very obvious to Hebrew ears. It is poetic parallelism. Go ahead and jot that down. Poetic parallelism. You see, in America, when we rhyme, we think Dr. Seuss. When we tell poetry, we think Dr. Seuss. We think of rhymes. We think of these kinds of things. But in Hebrew culture, when they did poetry, it wasn't based on rhyming. It wasn't based on individual words. It was based on parallel phrases. If you ever look in the book of Psalms, which is clearly poetic, you will see that quite often they say the same thing twice or even 3 times. And it's because poetry for the Hebrews was take one line and put it here, take another line and put it here, have them both be talking about the same thing in different ways, and the combination of the two gives you the new poetic meaning, gives you the understanding of what's going on. If you look in Genesis chapter 1, you should notice in your text that it's got weird indentation. It's all indented funny, unless you're using our live event and it's just, in a big glob. But if you're using your paper Bible there or something, it's got interesting indentation. You know why? Because in Hebrew, it's a poem. It's actually written as a poem with weird indentation all over the place. And now you need to understand how that poetry works. And so I'm going to do my best to run you through a chart of how this poem is structured, because it makes a huge difference to how we understand it. And so, Charlie, you got to keep up with me on these slides here, but let's go ahead and hit it. The first slide, we get this verse, Genesis 1:2. It tells us, the earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. There are a few key words here that I've highlighted. The words are formless, empty, and then the two words of deep and water together in the ancient Near East culture would refer to chaos or disorder. And so there are three themes in verse 2. Those three themes are: 1, the earth was formless; 2, the earth was empty; and then 3, there was no order. So before God does any creative work, he has to address these three problems. And as he does creative work, he needs to address these three problems. So here's the picture. Genesis 1:1, in the beginning God creates the heavens and the earth. He makes it all so that it exists. Genesis 1:2, he recognizes that the earth itself is missing some things. The earth itself is missing some things. It's formless, it's empty, it's got no order. So now he's beginning to focus in on the earth, and he's going to try to solve these problems. Let's go on. So, as we look at the verses for days 1, 2, and 3, we find these commands. God says, let there be light. He separates light from darkness. Let there be a sky. He separates water from water. I think that just means that, if you look up in the sky is blue. And someone a long time ago would be like, well, why is the sky blue? Maybe there's water above it. Maybe there's water below it, because there's the water down here, it's blue. The water up there, maybe it's blue. And so someone would look up into the sky and, not knowing what's really out there, might say, well, let's just call it water, because we don't know what it is. And back in their culture, water quite often was a metaphor for chaos or disorder or something. So anyway, let there be a sky to separate water from water. Let there be a sky. And finally, let the water on the ground be gathered together, so let dry ground appear. He's got three different things here that are all creating for us form. He's creating form to the earth. He's taking the earth and he's giving form to light and darkness. And he's giving form to air and water. And he's giving form to water and to dry ground. He's setting up for us the locations, the forms, how everything is going to take shape. In fact, let's go on to the next slide. You put this on a chart, and the first 3 days are days of form. Light and dark, sky and water, water and land. But if you were paying attention to the text as we read it earlier, day 3 has a bonus command. Every single day says, and God said, but day 3 adds, then God also said. We get a bonus command. Let's take a look at that real quick. It says this: let the land produce vegetation. So now that it's got dry ground, let's go ahead and make some plants on it. Let the land produce vegetation. Add that to the chart, and we get this next thing. Bonus command on the end, let's have some plants. Okay? Now let's look at days 4 through 6. If you look at the command words for days 4 through 6, we see this. Let there be lights in the sky to mark, to give light, and to govern. Let the water teem with creatures, and let birds fly. Be fruitful and fill the earth. Let the land produce creatures. In other words, what you've got is that the same order pertains of light and sky and dry ground. But now these are not days of form, these are days of filling. God takes the form and now he puts stuff in it. Because remember, the problem was the earth was formless and it was empty. So now he's putting stuff in it. Let's go ahead and see what that looks like. Days of filling, we've got sun, moon, and stars to fill up the light and the dark. We've got birds for the air and fish for the sea to fill up the sky and the water. Then we've got land animals to fill up the land. And if you've been paying attention, day 6 also has a bonus command, where it says, then God also said. Let's see what that line says. It says this, let us make mankind so that they may rule. So here's our bonus command. Add it to the chart. The bonus command at the end, God makes mankind. You see, these two are perfectly parallel. What God sets up in days 1 through 3, he then fills in days 4 through 6. There's a parallelism here. And that's intentional, even down to the bonus command that's given. Then at the very end of day 6, another line is added where God gives kind of a partial command, partial blessing. Let's see what it says. It says this, be fruitful, increase, fill, subdue, and rule over. God says that specifically to the human beings. So if we add it all together, we get a chart that looks like this. Days of form, days of filling, and finally a command at the very end. A final command for the human beings to take charge, for the human beings to exert order. What was the problem? The earth was formless, and it was empty, and it had no order. And now at the end of 6 days, we've got form, it's all filled up, and someone's in charge. See what's going on there? Exactly what needed to happen is what God did happen. What God did do and what he made happen. Okay, so that's the second key. We're going to pull all this together at the end. There's a third key we need to look at. A third key to try to understand what's really going on here, and this will surprise you, is the actual words God speaks. I listen to a lot of people who they come to a part of the Bible and they don't understand a particular part of the Bible, so they will say this, well, I heard someone tell me this. Or I read in my notes underneath the Bible, here's the text of the Bible, and then there's all these extra notes that are on the bottom. I read in my notes, or I studied this at one point in time, and my teacher, my professor told me this, or my whatever. Instead of paying attention to all the things you thought other people said about something, I want to encourage you to pay attention to what's actually there. Trust yourself. You know English. It's a language that you've grown accustomed to. Trust yourself when you're reading it, that you can actually pay attention to what's actually there. Now, let me show you what's actually there in what God says. Okay, let's take a look at this. Go on to the next slide there. He says, let there be light. Let there be a vault, the sky. Let the water be gathered together. Let dry ground appear. Let the land produce vegetation. So here we go. God is giving all these commands, and he says, let there be, let there be, let there be, let there be, and let that do, and let that do. And we get even more. Days 4 through 6. Let there be lights. Let them serve. Let them be lights. Let the water teem. Let birds fly. Let the land produce creatures. Now, if you pay attention to what's going on here, two things are happening here. One, sometimes God says, I want it. Let it happen, and it happens. It's like God's word is so powerful that his word can create things out of nothing. Okay? But there's something else that's going on here too. At least twice, God commands the land to do something. And once, he commands the water to do something. He doesn't say, hey, I want fish. He says, water, give me fish. He doesn't say, I want plants. He says, dirt, give me plants. He doesn't say, I want animals. He says, land, give me animals. He commands the earth to do some creation work on its own. He commands the earth to produce things. It's as if God is giving creative power to parts of his creation so that things can get better. That's one reason why he can say it's so good, because the creative work he did is still going. There's one last thing, though. All of this let there be, and let it happen, and let it do, changes when we get down to verses 26 and following. It says this, let us make mankind. And two things have changed. One thing that's changed is God is no longer talking to the void, and he's no longer talking to the land, and he's no longer talking to the water. He is speaking for himself. Like a king would use the plural to refer to himself, Like a king would say, we are going to do this thing. God is speaking in the plural about himself, and he says, let's do this thing. Let's get this thing done, and let's really get our hands dirty. And that's, in fact, the second thing that's different. The word make here is a completely different word from the Hebrew word bara we looked at earlier. The word make here is the Hebrew word asa. And asa is a very interesting Hebrew word that refers to getting your hands dirty. It refers to shaping things. When a potter is working on clay, he would be asa on that clay. When you're getting your hands dirty, it refers to a careful touch, an intentional touch. It refers to sometimes even a loving touch. When you're making something happen with your hands, God says, let's get our hands dirty and let's make humankind. See, all the commands are, I want it, let it be, let it be, let it do, let it do, let it do. Let's get it going on now. Let's make humanity. If you pay attention to the actual words, it's almost as if God says, I don't care how I get plants and trees, and I don't care how the lights get up, and I don't care how the animals come about. I just want them. But when it comes to people, I'm getting involved more directly than I have to this point. It's a fascinating thing that the words, the actual words God speaks, tell us something about his involvement in this whole process. Let's try to put it all together. If you put it all together, what does Genesis chapter 1 actually teach? Let me summarize it for you in a very complicated sentence. It says this: from nothing, God made everything through a process of increasing responsibility, culminating in humans designed to represent him. Here it is. From nothing, God made everything through a process of increasing responsibility, culminating in humans designed to represent him. God didn't need to start with something. He could say, I want light, and it happens. From nothing, God made everything. But here's the fascinating thing. The text itself teaches us process. God first forms, then he fills. It teaches us process. God creates the land, and then he tells the land, I want more stuff. And he gives the land the power of the process. God wants process. But one last thing, he wants responsibility. See, it's not just that the whole world increases in complexity, it's that every single thing that's created is in charge of something that came before. So let's make light, but later on, let's make stars and put them in charge of light. Let's make the sun and put it in charge of light. I want water and air, but later on, I want plants. I want birds and I want fish, and I want them to be in charge of this water and air. Let's make land, but later on, I want animals, and I want them to be responsible over this land, but ultimately, I want human beings to be responsible for it all. And that's why, when God makes humanity, he says, in our image. See, in the ancient Near East culture, this is the way it would work. A king would go to a land and he would conquer that land. But then he would want to conquer more lands or go back to his home palace. And so what he would do is he would set up a statue in the land he had just conquered, and then he would leave. And that statue was supposed to communicate to all the people who lived in that land, I'm still in charge. I might not be here, but I'm setting up an image of myself so that you know I'm still in charge. And everybody, when they looked at the statue, they should know, because I see the image, I know that that king is still in charge. And so God uses the same language when he talks about you and he talks about me. Let's make humanity in our image so that everything on the earth knows I'm still in charge. You see, you and I are supposed to be the people, supposed to be the thing on this planet by which everyone else knows that God's still in charge. God made this world good. He made this world beautiful. He made this world perfect and orderly. He took what was empty and he filled it. He took what was formless and he formed it. He took what needed order and he added order to it. And then at the end of it all, he says, and now I want someone to make sure this world continues being great. I want to make sure someone helps this world continue to be awesome. And I'm going to put my representative right there, my deputy, my image right there, so that everything else on this planet will know I'm still in charge and I'm good and I've made something good and you're keeping the ball rolling. So how do we take this home? What difference does it make in our lives? Ultimately, Genesis chapter 1 teaches you and me one very important lesson. And it's that you and I represent God. You and I represent a God who's so powerful he can speak from nothing and make it into something. You and I represent a God who's so powerful that he can say, I want it, and it happens. You and I represent a God who is so creative that he can come up with a giraffe and a zebra. You and I represent a God who is so orderly that he can make the sun and the earth and the moon all do their thing and not run into each other for a whole long period of time. You and I represent a God who is so loving that he would get his hands dirty when he makes you. You and I represent God. And so the question that we need to leave this place with is, when the world sees me, do they see that a good God is still in charge? That's the question. Are you living out his image? Are we living out his image? Did these people in Genesis live out his image? Did everything stay so awesome and perfect and beautiful forever? Well, you have to come back next week to find out. Listen, I want to leave you with this final thought about you're representing God, but I don't want me to give you the thought. I want God to give you the thought. So let me invite you to spend a few moments in reflection. Let me invite you to think and to ask God to speak into your heart something about what this means for you. God, what does it mean for me to represent you this week? What does it mean for the world to know that a good God is still in charge because of what they see in me? Right now, as the band comes back forward and they're going to lead us in one final song, I want to invite you to just jot some thoughts down on that card. And then when you're done with that card, put it down next to you, stand up and sing this final song with us, and let's give God our hearts one more time as we start this week. Let me pray for you. God in heaven, you made something amazing. You took what was formless and you formed it. You took what was empty and you filled it. You did exactly what needed to be done. And then on top of it all, you put us as the culmination of your creation to continue making something beautiful out of this world, to take charge and to lead the way to let people know you're still good and you're still in charge. But God, we've messed it up, and so we stand with you today saying we need a fresh start. We need a reboot. Help us this week to begin to live out more fully a life that represents you well. Speak to us now, even here in the quietness of this place. We pray in Jesus' name.
Thank you for listening to this message from Lafayette Community Church. We believe that God has a full and fulfilling life in store for you, and we want to help you live it. If you have any questions, feel free to contact me, Pastor Jeff, through the web form at LafayetteCommunityChurch.com. And as always, I encourage you to plug into a solid, God-honoring community wherever you may be. Life is a journey, and no one should ever walk alone.